I never thought my life would come to this, and even now when I close my eyes, I can still hear my son's voice echoing in the dark saying that I would be fine in the garage, as if the home I built with my husband, the home where every corner carries my memories, suddenly no longer belonged to me. My name is Margaret. I am 62 years old, and this is the true story of how my own son locked me out of my house and forced me to sleep among dusty boxes and cold cement, never realizing that the quiet woman he tried to push aside would find a way to take everything back in the most unexpected way. It all started on a soft spring morning when the sunlight streamed through my kitchen window and landed gently on the oak table my late husband built with his own hands. And I was standing there with a cup of tea, smiling at the sight of my son Tom and his wife Amber laughing on the porch. For a while, I believed my life was peaceful and full, with my small family under the same roof and the walls of the house breathing with the same warmth they always had. I loved to hear the sound of footsteps in the hallway, the hum of their conversations drifting from the living room, and the clinking of dishes at dinner because it made me feel like I was not alone in the big house anymore, that the emptiness left behind after my husband passed had finally been replaced by laughter again. In those early days after they moved in, I thought I was lucky, that I had a family that cared, and I cooked breakfasts and baked pies and tended the garden while feeling like I was living in a memory I had always wanted to hold on to. The smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven mixed with the soft scent of lilacs from the backyard, and sometimes I would catch Tom glancing at the photos on the mantel, the ones of him as a boy fishing with his father, and I thought that maybe we were healing together, that the house was full of love again. But slowly, almost without me noticing at first, little cracks began to show, like hairline fractures in a piece of glass that looked perfect until the light hit it just right. I would walk into the living room and find Amber whispering something to Tom, and the moment they saw me, they would fall silent and switch the conversation to something harmless, like the weather or groceries, and I would laugh it off and tell myself they were just sharing a private joke. Then one evening, I came down the stairs and saw them having dinner without me. 3 plates on the table, but only 2 of them filled, and Amber smiled politely and said they thought I might be tired, that it was better if I rested, and the words sounded kind on the surface, but somewhere deep inside my chest, a cold little knot started to form. It was in those small moments that I began to sense something shifting in the house I had called home for over 30 years, a house where I once woke to the smell of my husband's coffee and the sound of birds outside our window, a house where I believed I would always feel safe. Yet day by day I started to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, like a shadow drifting through hallways that used to echo with love. And I didn't know it yet, but that was just the beginning, the first ripple of a storm that would soon swallow me whole and force me into a cold, silent place I never thought I would be. I wish I could say that the uneasy feeling faded, that the little knot in my chest untangled itself, and I went back to the quiet happiness I felt when Tom and Amber first moved in, but instead each day added another layer to that feeling, like dust settling on furniture, until one day you realize the whole room is covered. At first, it was small things, almost easy to dismiss if I wanted to keep pretending everything was fine. I would wake up early to make breakfast, because I loved the way the smell of bacon and coffee filled the house, and I would hear the 2 of them laughing upstairs, whispering and giggling, and when I called up that breakfast was ready, they would come down together slowly, Amber with her perfect hair and that polite smile, and Tom rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and they would sit at the table, scrolling through their phones, barely talking to me except for a soft thank you as if I were a waitress instead of the woman who raised him. Then there were the afternoons when Amber would drift into the living room and start moving things, shifting the furniture a little to the left or taking down the floral curtains I had picked with my husband years ago, saying the house needed a more modern feel, and I would nod and smile even though a part of me wanted to hold on to every detail the way it was, as if keeping it all the same could keep my old life intact. One evening, I walked past the study and saw her holding a family photo of me and my husband, the frame in her hands, and she turned quickly, pretending she was just dusting. But I knew she had been thinking about where to hide it or maybe even remove it completely, because slowly the walls were losing their warmth and becoming a reflection of her taste, her presence. It was around that time that Tom started talking about space, as if the home that had always felt so big to me was suddenly too small now that they were there. He would sigh and say things like, "Mom, it's just a little crowded lately, don't you think?" Or, "Amber and I need our own area." And I would laugh gently and say, "Of course, we could figure something out because I wanted him to be happy. I wanted to be the mother who never became a burden." Then one evening, as we cleared the dinner table, Tom leaned against the counter and said it outright, his voice casual like he was asking me to pass the salt. He said they had been thinking I might want to stay in the garage for a while, just temporarily, so they could have more privacy upstairs. And I felt the words like a sharp sting beneath my ribs. He smiled in that way people do when they try to make something hurtful sound harmless, and Amber was standing behind him, nodding, saying it could be like my own little studio, cozy and private, as if moving me from the heart of my home to a cold cement space full of boxes and tools was some kind of thoughtful gift. I wanted to say no, to remind them whose name was on the deed, to tell them that the house was built for family, not for pushing someone out of sight. But the words got stuck in my throat because this was my son, the boy I held in my arms on sleepless nights, the boy I taught to ride a bike, and the thought of a fight with him felt heavier than the humiliation of agreeing. So I nodded, forcing a small smile, and said, "Maybe it could work for a little while. Maybe I could tidy the garage and make it comfortable." And Tom looked relieved while Amber clapped her hands together like a plan had just fallen into place. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of their voices upstairs. And I told myself it was temporary, that I was doing this out of love, that sometimes mothers sacrifice comfort to keep the peace. But somewhere, in the dark corners of my mind, the storm was already beginning to form, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to lose more than just my bedroom. I kept telling myself that it was only temporary, that moving into the garage would just be a small adjustment, and that everything would go back to normal once Tom and Amber had the space they wanted. But as the days passed, I started to feel the walls of my own life closing in, as if the house I had once walked through with pride and comfort was quietly shrinking around me. The first night I slept in the garage, I tried to make it feel like an adventure, lighting a little lamp and spreading an old quilt over the dusty couch, arranging a small table with a vase of artificial flowers I found in a box, telling myself that if I kept it cheerful, it wouldn't sting so much. But when the evening grew quiet and the sound of their laughter drifted through the closed windows of my own home, I felt something heavy in my chest that no amount of pretending could push away. The air smelled of oil and old wood. The concrete was cold under my feet, and somewhere in the rafters, I could hear a soft scratching of mice that reminded me that this was not a place meant for living, not for someone who had poured her life into that home. The next morning, I came into the kitchen early as I always did, thinking maybe we could have breakfast together, but when I walked in, Amber was already at the table with her laptop open and Tom beside her with a mug of coffee. And the way their eyes met before looking at me made my stomach tighten. Amber closed her laptop slowly like she was hiding something and said in that sweet voice that always sounded just a little too careful that I must have slept well, and maybe it would be better if I had my meals in the garage for now so they could have the dining area to themselves. She said it as if it were a suggestion, but Tom's silence told me it was already decided. I smiled and nodded, my throat dry, and went back to the garage with a plate of toast and eggs that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. It became my routine to stay out of the way, to drift like a ghost between the garage and the garden, watering my flowers and pulling weeds just to have something to do while they claimed the spaces that had once been mine. One afternoon, I walked into the living room quietly and found them sitting on the couch together, whispering over some papers spread on the coffee table, and when they noticed me, Amber quickly stacked the papers into a folder and smiled as if nothing had happened. I apologized for interrupting and went back outside, but the image stayed with me all day, the way they leaned close and shielded the papers, like they were building a life I wasn't meant to be part of. The first true humiliation came one evening when I tried to join them for dinner. I had made a small casserole in the garage because the kitchen felt like forbidden territory now, and I thought maybe if I brought it in, we could share a meal together like old times. But when I walked into the dining room carrying the dish, Amber was already setting the table for two, and Tom glanced at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before, a mixture of impatience and guilt, and he said they were planning a quiet evening alone. I froze for a moment, then smiled weakly, set the casserole on the counter, and walked back to the garage as casually as I could, my face burning even though there was no one to see. That night, I ate my portion alone in the dim light, the sound of their laughter and clinking glasses seeping through the walls. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in the home I had once believed would always be mine. I lay awake for hours staring at the exposed beams of the garage ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the house beyond my reach, and I thought about the years I spent working, saving, and caring for that home, about my husband who had built the porch with his own hands, and about the boy I had raised into the man who now treated me like an inconvenience to be managed quietly out of sight. And as the night stretched on, a quiet resolve began to take root beneath the hurt. A whisper in the dark that told me something was wrong, that I needed to open my eyes and see what they were really doing before it was too late. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm, as if the house and I were breathing out of sync, and I kept telling myself that I could endure this small humiliation if it kept the peace. But deep inside my chest, the unease was growing heavier with each passing hour. One late afternoon, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the warm spring light, and I sat in the garage listening to the patter of rain against the roof, hugging a blanket around my shoulders while thinking about the life I used to have inside those walls. I could hear the faint sound of music from the living room, a cheerful melody that didn't match the heaviness in my heart, and for a moment I imagined walking right in, sitting on the couch, and asking my son why I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own home. That night, something unexpected happened. A loud crash woke me from a restless sleep, the kind where dreams are full of half-finished memories and whispered voices, and I shot up on the old couch with my heart racing. The wind howled, the rain beat against the windows, and another crash echoed from outside. I rushed to the garage door and flung it open, and my breath caught as I saw one of the old oak trees in the backyard leaning dangerously, its massive branches swaying in the storm. For a split second, I thought it was going to fall right onto the house, the home I loved so much, and instinct took over. I ran barefoot through the mud, my nightgown soaked in seconds, and started pulling at the garden chairs and flower pots, scattered by the wind, desperate to save what I could, when suddenly the door burst open and Tom appeared, shouting my name. For that one brief moment, I saw something in his eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to run to me when thunder scared him. He grabbed my arm, pulling me under the porch as the wind whipped around us, and we both watched as the tree finally cracked and fell, not on the house, but safely into the yard with a deafening thud that shook the ground. The rain poured, and for a heartbeat we just stood there, both breathing hard, the storm around us making it feel like the world had split open. And I thought maybe, just maybe, he saw me again, not as a burden, but as his mother who had always loved and protected him. He asked if I was okay, his voice almost tender, and I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. And for that fleeting second, I believed things could still be mended, that the storm outside had washed away whatever had grown between us. But by the next morning, the moment had passed like a dream. The tree was gone, chopped into logs by a neighbor. The porch was dry and the house felt the same, warm and alive for them, cold and distant for me. Tom went back to his quiet nods, Amber went back to her polite smiles, and I went back to my little corner in the garage. but something had shifted in me after that storm. I realized how fragile my place in this house had become, how easily I could be swept away like a loose chair in the wind. And deep down, I knew that the next storm, whether it came from the sky or from within my family, would not pass so harmlessly. The morning after the storm, the air was crisp and cool, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the cracks of the garage as if the world had been washed clean. But inside my chest, the heaviness remained, a quiet reminder that storms outside pass more easily than storms inside a family. I spent the day cleaning up the garden, arranging the pots and chairs back into their places, trying to restore some sense of normalcy, while inside the house, I could hear the soft hum of music and occasional bursts of laughter from Tom and Amber. Every time I heard their voices, it was like a little echo reminding me that life was moving on without me, that the warmth of the home I had built was no longer meant for me. By the end of the week, things took a turn I had been dreading, though I still hoped in some corner of my heart it would never come. I returned from a short walk to the mailbox one sunny afternoon, the sky impossibly blue and the smell of lilacs heavy in the air, and as I reached for the back door to the kitchen, the handle wouldn't turn. I frowned and jiggled it, thinking maybe it had stuck, but it was firm and unyielding. My stomach tightened as I tried the side door, then the front, each one refusing to open, and for a moment I just stood there on the porch, the sound of birds chirping in the trees, my reflection staring back at me from the glass. I knocked softly at first, then harder, calling my son's name, and after a long pause, the door finally opened just a crack, and Tom stood there, his face unreadable. He said he had changed the locks. He said it in the same tone someone might use to comment on the weather, calm and simple, as if the words were nothing more than a fact. My heart lurched, and I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh or to explain. But instead, he told me that it was for the best, that it would keep things organized, that I would be fine in the garage, that I had everything I needed out there. His words floated in the warm afternoon air, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there on the porch, because it felt like the world had tilted beneath me. Behind him, I could see Amber, her arms crossed, watching quietly, her polite smile gone, replaced with something cold I couldn't quite name. I wanted to scream, to demand my place, to remind him that this was my house, my life, my memories and every nail and board, but instead the words stuck like stones in my throat. I nodded slowly, too stunned to argue, and turned away as the door closed softly behind me, the click of the new lock sounding louder than the crack of the tree falling during the storm. I walked back to the garage on legs that felt like they didn't belong to me, the world spinning a little, and sat down on the dusty couch, staring at the concrete floor as the weight of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy blanket I couldn't shake off. That night, I lay awake listening to the faint hum of their laughter through the walls, every giggle and clink of glasses a reminder that I was now outside my own life, that I was looking in through windows I had once cleaned with pride, and for the first time a new feeling began to grow in me, something sharper than sadness, something that whispered that perhaps being quiet and patient had only given them permission to push me further away. I didn't know it yet, but that quiet, simmering ache was the first spark of something that would soon turn into the strength I needed to take my life back in a way they never saw coming. The days after Tom changed the locks felt like stepping into a life I didn't recognize, a strange, hollow version of the world I had built with my own hands and heart. Mornings came slow in the garage, the sunlight creeping through the dusty window, cutting across boxes labeled with memories I could almost touch, but not quite hold. I would wake on that old couch with my back stiff, the chill of the concrete floor seeping into my bones, and for a few seconds, in the soft haze of waking, I would forget where I was and imagine I was still in my bedroom upstairs, the one with the floral quilt and the soft carpet that always felt warm under my feet. But then the garage walls came into focus, gray and bare, and the sound of footsteps above me reminded me that my life had been moved out of sight, tucked away like an old chair no one wanted in the living room anymore. I tried to keep some kind of routine, because routines are what keep a heart from collapsing completely. I would water the flowers in the garden every morning, talking to them in whispers like they could hear me, telling them little stories about my day, about the weather, about the way the world felt smaller now. The garden had always been my sanctuary, a patch of color and life that my husband and I had planted together in the early years of our marriage, and working in it made me feel close to him again, like his presence still lingered in the smell of the roses and the hum of the bees. But even there, I felt like an intruder, because sometimes I would catch Amber watching me from the kitchen window, her eyes cool and distant, like she was calculating something I couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, I went to bring in a basket of tomatoes I had picked, thinking maybe I could leave them on the counter as a peace offering, a reminder that I was still part of this home in some small way. But when I walked up to the door, the new lock gleamed in the sunlight, and I froze. I stood there for a long moment, the basket heavy in my hands, before finally setting it down on the step like a delivery for strangers. I knocked softly, and after a pause, Amber opened the door just wide enough to take the basket. She smiled, thanked me sweetly, and closed the door again without inviting me in, and I walked back to the garage with my heart heavier than the tomatoes I had carried. At night, the loneliness pressed in hardest, curling into my chest like a living thing. I would lie on the couch staring at the ceiling, tracing the lines of the exposed beams in the dim light, and the sounds of the house reached me in fragments, the muffled hum of the television, the creak of footsteps, sometimes laughter, sometimes nothing at all. It felt like I was listening to another family living the life I had been pushed out of, like I had become a ghost haunting my own home. I thought of my husband often during those nights, wondering what he would say if he could see the way things had turned, if he would be angry or heartbroken or simply silent like me. But in the quiet, something else began to take root, growing slowly beneath the sadness. It wasn't anger, not yet, but it was something sharp, something awake. I started noticing little details I had overlooked before, like the way Tom and Amber always seemed to hide their papers whenever I walked by, or the fact that they were receiving more mail than usual, thick envelopes that never made their way to the garage. One morning, I saw a man in a suit walking up the driveway carrying a briefcase, and I ducked behind the garden shed instinctively, my heart thumping in my chest. I watched as Tom met him at the door, shook his hand and let him in quickly, glancing over his shoulder like he didn't want anyone to see. The meeting lasted less than an hour, and when the man left, I noticed Amber standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, a satisfied little tilt to her chin that made something inside me twist. That was the moment I realized that this wasn't just about them wanting space or privacy. Something else was happening, something that had nothing to do with love or family and everything to do with secrets. I didn't know yet what their plan was, but I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just that they wanted me in the garage. They wanted me small. They wanted me invisible. And maybe, just maybe, they wanted something that belonged to me, something they couldn't take as long as I was standing in the light. So I started watching, quietly, carefully, like a shadow moving through its own house. I memorized the times they came and went, the visitors who showed up when they thought I wasn't paying attention, the way they sometimes disappeared into the study with their folders and closed the door tight. At first, I told myself it was just curiosity, a mother's instinct to know what her child was up to. But deep down, I knew it was something else. It was the first thread of a plan forming, even if I didn't yet know how to pull it. One evening, I had a small scare that nearly broke me and somehow hardened me at the same time. I was carrying a box of old photo albums from the garage to the garden table, thinking I might flip through them to remind myself that once upon a time, this house had been filled with love and laughter that included me when my foot caught on the edge of a broken step and I stumbled forward. The box flew from my hands, spilling photos across the damp grass, and for a moment the shock of the fall stole my breath. I sat there on the ground, heart pounding, my ankle throbbing, rain from the day before soaking through my nightgown, and I felt the hot sting of tears pushing up. But then I looked at the photos around me, images of birthdays and family vacations, of Tom as a little boy with cake on his face, and me holding him like he was the whole world. And something inside me shifted. I gathered those photos with shaking hands, wiped the mud from them gently, and carried them back to the garage. I sat there for hours, looking at them under the yellow lamplight, and instead of crying, I began to think. I thought about what I had lost, yes, but also about what I still had. My memories, my name on the papers that proved this house was mine, and a strength I had almost forgotten I carried. And as the night deepened and the house grew quiet, I felt the first real spark of resolve settle into me like a coal that refused to die out. They had pushed me out, locked me away, and treated me like a ghost, but I was not gone. I was still here. And if they thought I was going to fade quietly into the shadows, they were about to learn that even the softest ghosts can decide to haunt. The days slid into each other like soft shadows, and though the sun still rose and set, my life felt caught in a slow twilight, neither fully alive nor completely gone. The garage had become my world, a strange island of memory and waiting, but the house just a few feet away felt like another country, one I needed a passport to enter and a reason to be allowed in. And yet, even in my exile, I was watching, always watching, because I had begun to understand that knowledge would be my only weapon if I ever hoped to reclaim my place or protect what was mine. I started small, keeping to my quiet routine, but letting my eyes and ears do the work. In the mornings, when Amber left for her yoga class, I noticed the way she lingered in the driveway, speaking softly on the phone, glancing back at the house as if she feared being overheard. Tom, on the other hand, had grown quieter with me, his visits to the garage less frequent, as if seeing me had become an inconvenience he'd rather avoid. But in those rare moments, he did stop by. I caught things, fragments of papers, peeking out from under his arm, glimpses of envelopes stamped with the names of banks or law offices, small but undeniable pieces of a puzzle I had not yet fully assembled. One afternoon, I heard a knock on the front door while I was trimming the roses along the side of the house. I froze in place, half hidden behind the bush, and saw a man in a gray suit standing there with a black briefcase. My heart gave a strange twist. He wasn't the same man I'd seen before, but had that same air of business, official and detached, as though the house was no longer just a home, but a transaction waiting to happen. Tom opened the door, stepped out onto the porch, and shook the man's hand firmly, glancing around once as if to check if the neighbors, or perhaps his mother, were watching. I crouched lower, the scent of roses mixing with the smell of damp soil, my fingers curling into the dirt as I strained to listen. I couldn't catch the words, only the cadence, short, sharp sentences, a nervous chuckle, then the sound of paper rustling, like documents being handed over. When the man left, Tom stood on the porch for a moment, his face drawn tight, and I swear I saw him hesitate before looking back at the door, where Amber appeared behind the glass. She smiled at him, slow and satisfied, and that smile stayed in my mind long after they had both gone inside. It was a smile of victory, of someone who thought the game was already won. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, the yellow light of the old lamp flickering against the metal shelves, and I felt my thoughts circling like restless birds. I needed to know what they were planning. I needed to understand why I had been pushed aside, why the locks had been changed, and why strangers were now walking into my home with briefcases while I sat in a garage like an unwanted guest. The opportunity came 2 days later, when Amber left for one of her long afternoons out, and Tom, I knew, had gone to meet someone at the town hall. I waited, heart pounding, until the driveway was empty and the house seemed still, and then I crept across the garden to the back door. The new locks were solid, but I had noticed something when I watered the flowers the day before. A small window in the laundry room that hadn't been latched fully. It took effort, careful and quiet, but I managed to slide it open and climb in, my feet landing on the tile floor with the softest thud. For the first time in weeks, I was inside my own home again. The air felt different here, warmer, scented faintly with cinnamon and detergent, a comfort and a sting all at once. I moved slowly, almost reverently, taking in every detail as if I were visiting a place I once loved that now belonged to someone else. I passed through the hallway, my fingers brushing the photographs on the wall, family vacations, birthdays, holidays, all frozen moments of a life that had somehow slipped through my fingers. My footsteps were silent on the carpet as I reached the study, and my pulse quickened when I saw the desk covered in papers. I hesitated, fear and resolve fighting in my chest, and then I stepped closer. The papers were spread out in neat stacks, and my eyes caught on phrases that made my breath catch. Words like property transfer, signature, estate value, and co-ownership. My name was there, printed in bold letters at the top of several pages, and suddenly the world tilted again. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were planning to take the house itself, to move me out of my life completely, to leave me with nothing but the cold echo of my memories. As I stood there, trying to breathe past the sharp knot in my throat, a sound from outside made my heart leap, a car pulling into the driveway. My hands trembled as I hurried to gather myself, leaving the papers exactly as I'd found them, and I darted down the hall to the laundry room. I barely managed to slip out the small window and run back to the garage before I heard the front door open and their voices float through the air. My chest heaved, and I pressed my back against the garage wall, feeling my heartbeat in my fingertips, a mix of fear, betrayal, and a spark of something new, determination. They thought I was invisible. They thought I was small. But now I knew what they were planning, and for the first time since my exile to the garage, I felt like the ghost they had made me into was awake and ready to haunt the people who had forgotten who I really was. The night after I found those papers, I barely slept, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't the kind of sleeplessness that left me hollow and numb. My mind was awake in a different way now, alive with the pulse of quiet determination, with the soft whisper of plans beginning to take shape in the dark corners of my thoughts. The garage felt less like a cage and more like a base camp, a hidden place where I could observe and think, where I could wait for the perfect moment to move. I lay on that creaky old couch with the weight of a thin blanket over my shoulders, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator and the soft groan of the pipes, and in my head I was already plotting my way back into the life they thought they had stolen from me. In the morning, I moved through my routine with careful calm, watering the roses and trimming the dead leaves from the potted geraniums by the side of the house. My hands were steady, but inside, my thoughts twisted and turned like a river after a storm. I kept seeing those papers in my mind, the bold letters of my name staring back at me like a silent alarm, and the word transfer burned behind my eyes. They were planning to take everything I had worked for, the home where my husband and I had spent decades building our lives, the place where my son had taken his first steps, had celebrated his first birthday, had run laughing through the hallways on Christmas morning. And yet, now, he and that smiling woman he called his wife were trying to sweep me out like an old rug they no longer wanted underfoot. I knew then that I couldn't just sit and wait for them to finish what they had started. I couldn't beg or plead or hope for some spark of decency to rise up in them, because that spark was gone, smothered under greed or ambition or something colder I couldn't quite name. If I wanted to survive this, I needed to think like a survivor. And for the first time, I let myself whisper that quiet word I hadn't dared to think before. Revenge. Not loud, not violent, but something sharper and quieter, the kind of revenge that feels like justice, the kind that slides in like a shadow and leaves no mark except the truth shining in the light. My first step was to gather proof, to turn my quiet suspicions into something solid that couldn't be ignored or twisted. I waited for another day when the house was empty, when Amber drove off in her spotless white SUV and Tom headed to town. And then I slipped through the same laundry window, my heart pounding like it had the first time, but steadier now, with purpose. The study was just as I had left it, neat and organized, and I moved quickly, flipping through the papers with careful fingers, memorizing the dates and names. I didn't take anything, not yet, but I found a small, spiral notebook on the desk, its pages filled with notes in Amber's tidy handwriting, and that was when I realized just how deep their plan went. She had written everything down, little to-do lists and reminders like call lawyer, sign final draft, and one that made my stomach twist, arrange storage for garage boxes. It wasn't just the house they were after. They were planning to erase me completely, to take the last fragments of my life and move them somewhere I couldn't even see. I snapped a few pictures of the papers and the notebook pages with the old phone I kept tucked under my pillow in the garage, my hands trembling only slightly as I worked. It felt like holding a candle in a dark room, small and flickering, but still enough to see the path forward. That evening, something unexpected almost gave me away, and my heart leapt into my throat so hard I thought I might faint. I had just returned to the garage, my secret photos stored on my phone, when I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. I froze, every muscle in my body tight, and the garage door creaked open. Tom stepped inside, his face unreadable, and I felt like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. He glanced around, his eyes sliding over the boxes and the old couch, and then he sighed. He said he just wanted to check if I needed anything, and I forced a small smile, my voice soft and calm, though my heart was racing like a trapped bird. In that moment, he walked closer to the shelf by the door, and his foot brushed against the edge of one of the photo boxes I had nearly knocked over earlier. My whole body went cold, because if he saw the dirt smudge or the faint dampness still clinging to the cardboard, he might ask questions I wasn't ready to answer. But then he simply nodded, said he had a meeting to get to, and left, the door closing behind him with a final metallic thud. I waited a full 10 minutes before I allowed myself to breathe normally again, my hands still pressed to my chest as if I could hold my heart in place. After that near miss, I knew I had to be even more careful. My revenge could not be rushed, and it could not be messy. These were people who had already underestimated me, and if I wanted to win this quiet war, I had to let them keep underestimating me until the very last moment. So I returned to my garage world and began to prepare in small, subtle ways, organizing the old documents my husband had kept in a locked file box, digging out the original deed to the house, and calling, from a borrowed neighbor's phone, an old friend of my husband's who had once worked in real estate law. I didn't tell him everything, not yet, but I asked if he would meet me for coffee one day soon, because I might need advice. His warm, calm voice on the other end felt like a lifeline, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a fragile thread of hope weaving through my chest. The strangest thing was how invisible I had become to my own son and his wife, and how much that invisibility now worked in my favor. They never questioned where I was, never asked what I did with my days, never thought that the quiet old woman in the garage could be paying attention or thinking ahead. And in that invisibility, I found my strength growing, my resolve hardening like a seed pushing through the dirt toward the light. They had pushed me into the shadows, but they didn't realize that shadows can see everything, and sometimes the things that grow in the dark are the hardest to kill. One evening, as I sat in the garage looking over the photos I had taken, the golden light of sunset streaming through the small, dusty window, I felt a shift inside me, a calm, quiet certainty that I would not only survive this, but I would make sure they never forgot who I was and what I was capable of. It wouldn't be loud, and it wouldn't be cruel, but it would be unforgettable. The next morning began with a heavy sky, clouds hanging low over the neighborhood, casting everything in a dim gray light that seemed to match the weight in my chest. I sat up on my narrow garage couch, stretching my stiff arms and shoulders, and listened to the gentle patter of drizzle against the roof. The world outside felt hushed, as if holding its breath, and I realized it was the perfect day to take my first real step out of the shadows. For weeks, I had gathered knowledge and nursed my hurt, but now I was ready to let my quiet plan unfurl, one cautious step at a time. I dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue sweater and neat slacks, clothes that felt like my old self, the woman who had once hosted family dinners and arranged flowers in the kitchen window. I brushed my hair and applied a touch of lipstick with trembling hands, staring at the small mirror I kept on the garage shelf. For a moment, I barely recognized the face looking back, lined with exhaustion, yet sharp with determination, eyes alive with the fire of someone who has been wronged but refuses to disappear. By mid-morning, Tom and Amber had left, their cars gone from the driveway, and the quiet of the house settled over the yard like a waiting sigh. I locked the garage behind me and walked down the block to Mrs. Henderson's house, a kindly neighbor who still thought I was just staying in the garage while the renovations were sorted. She smiled warmly when she saw me at her door and let me use her phone, never asking too many questions, which was a gift I didn't take lightly. I dialed the number I had written on a scrap of paper, the number of my late husband's old friend, Richard, who had spent his career helping families navigate property laws and estate matters. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady and familiar, and I explained in cautious words that I might need his advice about protecting my home. I didn't share every painful detail yet, but he didn't need me to. There was a pause, then a quiet hum of understanding in his tone. He suggested we meet at a small cafe on the other side of town the following afternoon, and I felt a quiet wave of relief wash over me. I thanked him and hung up, my hand lingering on the receiver as if I were holding on to that small thread of hope. That night, the rain grew heavier, and I sat in the garage with the soft rattle of drops against the windows, going over every piece of information I had collected. The photos on my phone, the mental map of the papers on Tom's desk, the memory of Amber's smug little smile, all of it formed a story. And I knew that story was powerful if I could bring it into the light. I tucked the phone into the lining of my purse and packed a small folder of the original house deed, insurance papers, and my marriage certificate, knowing they might be my shield in the days to come. But even as I felt the stirrings of purpose, life had a way of testing me, of dangling danger just close enough to remind me how fragile my position really was. The next afternoon, as I walked the quiet streets toward the bus stop that would take me to the cafe, a car slowed behind me, and I felt the weight of eyes on my back. My heart began to pound as I turned slightly and saw Amber's white SUV creeping along the curb. She rolled down the window, her manicured hand resting on the door, and gave me a sharp little smile that sent a chill through me. She asked where I was headed, her voice sweet in a way that made my skin prickle. I forced a calm smile and said I was just taking a walk to clear my head, that the garage felt a little stuffy. She tilted her head, as if she didn't quite believe me, but after a long moment, she nodded and drove away, her taillights fading into the gray mist. My knees felt weak, but I kept walking, every step measured, my pulse slowing only when the bus arrived and I climbed aboard, blending into the small cluster of strangers. The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt some of the tension slip from my shoulders. Richard was already there, sitting at a corner table with a leather briefcase beside him, his silver hair and kind eyes, just as I remembered. He rose to hug me gently, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was not completely alone. I slid into the chair across from him and began to tell my story, carefully at first, and then, like a dam breaking, the words poured out. I spoke of the garage, the changed locks, the strangers with briefcases, the papers with my name and the word transfer, the coldness in my son's eyes, and the quiet cruelty in Amber's smile. Richard listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from disbelief to sorrow to a kind of quiet anger. When I finished, he leaned forward and told me something that sent both a shiver of fear and a spark of hope through me. If they were trying to transfer the property without my full and willing consent, it could be challenged. I still had rights, he said, but I needed to move carefully, document everything, and avoid letting them know that I was on to them. He promised to help me prepare the paperwork to secure my position and to check the local records to see if anything had already been filed. When I left the cafe, the drizzle had turned to a light sun shower, golden light breaking through the clouds in soft streaks, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I wasn't just surviving in a garage, but living again, in my own home, with my head held high. But even in that fragile hope, I felt the edge of danger, because the moment Tom and Amber realized I was no longer powerless, they would strike harder than ever. That night, I lay awake listening to the rain, thinking of Richard's promise, and I whispered to myself in the dark that I would be ready. They thought they had already buried me under the weight of their betrayal, but they had forgotten that some roots grow strongest underground, waiting for the right moment to break through. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope stretched over a deep canyon, every step careful, every breath measured, because I knew one wrong move could send me tumbling into a place I might never climb out of. Richard had taken my documents and promised to start the legal work quietly, but in the meantime, my life in the garage went on as if nothing had changed. Tom and Amber still came and went, with their cold nods and polite dismissals, treating me like a shadow in my own home, and I let them believe that nothing inside me had shifted, that I was still the small, defeated figure they had pushed into the corner of their lives. But inside, a fire burned. I spent my days quietly preparing, collecting every scrap of evidence, memorizing details, and waiting for the next move. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of peach and violet, I noticed something strange. A black car parked down the street, just far enough to seem casual, but close enough to unsettle me. I watched from the small garage window, my heart tapping faster, and, after a while, I saw Tom step out of the house and walk to the car. The window rolled down, and he leaned in to speak to the driver, his posture tense, his head turning once toward the garage. I ducked away from the window, my breath caught in my throat, and waited in silence until I heard the car pull away. That night, I could barely sleep, because a new thought gnawed at me. They weren't just planning to take the house, they were planning something else, something final, a way to remove me completely from their lives, and the fear settled in my chest like cold iron. But fear can be a powerful teacher, and it sharpened my resolve. I knew that if I wanted to survive this and reclaim my life, I had to be one step ahead of them, no matter what. The unexpected confrontation came sooner than I thought. 2 days later, Amber appeared in the garage unannounced, her perfume flooding the small space, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. She smiled that too sweet smile and said she was just checking in, her eyes roaming over the piles of boxes and my makeshift bed as if she were cataloging the last pieces of my existence. Then she dropped a casual remark that made my stomach turn. She said a moving company would be coming next week to help organize things, and it might be easier if I stayed somewhere else for a few days. I felt my heart pound so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I kept my face calm and even let my shoulders sag as if in tired agreement. I told her I would figure something out, that I didn't want to be in the way. She seemed satisfied with that, gave a little nod, and walked out with a swish of her long coat, leaving the faint scent of roses and coldness behind. But the moment she was gone, I felt the reality settle over me like a storm. This was it, the final stage of their plan, and if I didn't act soon, I would be gone, erased like a chalk mark in the rain. The next day, Richard called with news that both terrified and strengthened me. He had discovered that a transfer of ownership had already been initiated, with documents filed under my name, but using a signature that was suspiciously shaky and incomplete, as if someone had tried to copy it without quite knowing how my hand moved. He told me we could stop it, but it would require a bold step, a formal complaint, and an injunction, which would mean confronting Tom and Amber head-on in a way they could not ignore. That night, something unexpected and terrifying happened, and for a moment I thought all my plans were about to crumble. A loud crash woke me from a light sleep in the garage, and when I jumped up, heart racing, I saw shadows moving past the window. I froze, and then I realized it was Tom, fumbling with something in the dark. I opened the garage door slowly, and he spun around holding a box of my old photo albums, the lid half off and pictures spilling onto the wet concrete. He muttered that he was just organizing things for the movers, but the look in his eyes was sharp, watchful, almost accusing. I bent down silently, gathering the soaked photographs, and in that moment one of the pictures, a snapshot of Tom as a little boy sitting on his father's shoulders, both of them grinning, stuck to my palm. My heart clenched, because I saw, just for an instant, the boy I had raised, the child I had loved beyond reason, the life I had poured all of myself into, and I almost faltered. But then he took the box and left without another word, and I knew the boy in that photograph was gone. The next morning, the sky was clear and cold, and I walked into the sunlight with my purse tucked under my arm, my documents secured, and my heart braced for what was coming. Richard met me at the courthouse, and together we filed the papers that would freeze the transfer, sending an official notice that the supposed agreement was under dispute. I knew this would ignite a storm at home, but I also knew I had to light this match if I wanted my life back. When I returned to the garage that afternoon, Tom was waiting, his face tight with barely contained anger. He demanded to know what I had done, his voice raised, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. I stood my ground, my voice steady but soft, and told him that I had simply protected my home, the home his father had built for this family, the home I was still legally part of. He said things I will never forget. Cruel and cold, words meant to cut me down to nothing, but I didn't let them break me this time. Instead, I met his gaze and told him that the days of me being invisible were over. The air between us crackled like a wire about to snap, and for a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything, but he turned and stormed out, leaving the garage door swinging open in the wind. I stood there, feeling both shaken and stronger than I had in months, and I knew the battle was truly beginning. But what he didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had one last card to play, one that would bring the story full circle and deliver the justice they thought I would never dare to seek. The house felt like a battlefield waiting for the first shot, even though no words were spoken for the next 2 days. Tom and Amber moved around like silent storms, doors opening and closing with sharp clicks, footsteps thudding across the floorboards above my garage ceiling. I stayed in my corner, quiet but unbroken, keeping my phone close and checking for updates from Richard. Each time it buzzed, my heart jumped, and when his message finally came, short and to the point, it sent a shiver of both fear and anticipation through me. They tried to refile today. Blocked. They know. I sat back on my narrow couch, the words burning into my mind like sparks on dry paper. They knew. That meant the game had changed, and I could feel it in the air even before Tom appeared in the garage doorway that evening, his shoulders squared, his jaw tight. He didn't shout. He didn't even step fully inside. He just told me that I had made a big mistake and that I could have had things the easy way. His voice was low, almost calm, and that made it more terrifying than if he had screamed. I held my ground, my hands clasped in my lap to keep them from shaking, and said nothing, because I knew anything I said now could only fuel his anger. He stared at me a moment longer, then turned and left, his footsteps fading into the house. That night I barely slept, my heart fluttering with the feeling that something was building, something inevitable. I woke before dawn and watched the pale gray lights spill into the garage, illuminating the boxes, the old photos, the small fragments of a life I had built and loved. I thought of my husband and whispered a promise to him that I would see this through, that I would not let the family home be stolen by greed and betrayal. Late that morning, the first twist came, sharp and unexpected. A knock rattled the garage door, and when I opened it, a man in a crisp suit and polished shoes stood there with a clipboard in hand. Behind him, a small moving truck idled at the curb, and two men in uniforms waited. He introduced himself as a representative from the moving company and said he was here to relocate my things per the homeowner's request. For a heartbeat, I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. But then I felt a sudden, fierce calm settle over me. I told him, in my most polite but steady voice, that there must be a mistake because there was a court order in place and this property transfer was currently under legal dispute. He frowned and said he would need to confirm that. I walked back into the garage, retrieved the copy of the injunction Richard had given me, and held it up for him to see. His eyes scanned the page, and then he nodded slowly and told the movers to wait. Just then, Amber stormed out of the house, her hair perfectly curled, her voice dripping with false innocence as she asked what the problem was. When the man explained that there was an active dispute and they could not proceed without clarification, the mask slipped for a moment, and her eyes flashed with anger. She tried to insist, waving her hands and talking about family decisions and necessary changes. But the man shook his head, his tone firm now, and said he couldn't risk it. She turned on me then, her voice low and sharp, and told me I was making things ugly and that I should be ashamed for causing so much trouble. But the real shock came moments later when Tom stepped outside, his face pale and tense, and for the first time, I saw something crack in him. Not just anger, but fear. He grabbed Amber by the arm and pulled her back toward the house, muttering something I couldn't hear, and for a moment I stood there in the cool morning air, holding my ground as the truck drove away. It felt like a victory, but only a fragile one, because I knew this would push them to a breaking point. That night, the storm I had felt gathering finally broke. Tom came into the garage after dark, his face shadowed, and he sat down heavily on the edge of an old chair, his hands clasped tightly. For the first time in months, his voice wavered. He said he never meant for it to go this far, that he thought it would all happen quietly, that Amber had promised me I'd be taken care of, and that he didn't know how things had spun out of control. I listened in silence, my heart a knot of sorrow and resolve. Then came the real twist, the thing I never expected. He told me Amber had been the one pushing for everything, that she had already lined up a buyer for the house, and that she had made promises behind his back too, promises that didn't include him. He had overheard her on the phone with a man he didn't recognize, talking about finalizing things and splitting it once she's out. His voice cracked when he said it, and for a moment I saw my son again, lost and trapped in a mess of his own making. I felt my breath catch, because the betrayal I had been drowning in suddenly had another edge, a betrayal inside their own little alliance. And that, I realized, might be the key to turning everything around. After Tom's confession, the world around me felt different, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, listening to the truth that had finally cracked open. I sat in the dim glow of the garage light, my hands folded in my lap, my heart both heavy and strangely hopeful, because for the first time in months, I saw a sliver of the boy I once knew peeking through the hardened shell of the man he had become. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his voice hushed and broken, saying he didn't know how to fix what he had done. And for a long moment, neither of us spoke, because the weight of all those lost years hung between us like mist in the night. Finally, I told him that it wasn't too late to tell the truth, that there was still a way to set things right, but it would take courage he hadn't shown in a long time. He didn't answer right away, his jaw tightening, his eyes shifting as if searching for the boy who used to look to me for guidance. When he finally met my gaze, there was a flicker of resolve, but also fear, because he knew that facing Amber meant facing the life he had built on lies. The next day, everything moved faster than I expected, like the first stones tumbling down a hill before the avalanche begins. Richard called in the morning, his voice steady but tense, saying he had received a call from the county office. Someone had tried to withdraw the dispute and finalize the transfer again, but thanks to the court documents, it had been blocked automatically. That someone, of course, was Amber. She was running out of patience, and I could feel the storm gathering in every corner of the house. That afternoon, I heard shouting upstairs. At first, I thought it was another of their hushed arguments spilling over, but the volume rose until I could hear every word, and my heart pounded as I realized the confrontation had begun. Tom was demanding answers, asking about the man on the phone, about the promises she had made, about how she could plan to sell the house out from under both of us. Amber's voice was sharp, angry, full of denial and venom, accusing him of weakness, of letting me manipulate him, of ruining the plan. Then there was a crash, the sound of something breaking, and my hands trembled as I pressed them to my chest, because I didn't know how far this would go. Suddenly, footsteps thundered down the stairs, and Amber appeared in the doorway of the garage, her face flushed, her eyes blazing like dark coals. She said in a cold, clipped voice that I had destroyed everything, that I was tearing apart her life, and that I would regret this. Behind her, Tom hovered in the doorway of the house, looking torn apart, his hands half raised as if he didn't know whether to reach for her or for me. I stood as tall as I could, feeling a strange calm settle over me, and told her simply that I would not be leaving, that this house was mine as much as anyone's, and that her lies were over. For a heartbeat, I thought she might strike me, her hand twitching as she took a step forward, but then she stopped, her chest rising and falling as she stared at me with pure hatred. Then, in a sudden movement, she turned and stormed out the garage door into the driveway, her phone already in her hand, calling someone I couldn't hear. Moments later, her car engine roared, and she sped away, leaving Tom standing there, pale and shaken. That night was long and sleepless, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge, every shadow feeling like a whisper of what might come next. In the early morning hours, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of voices outside. When I peeked through the garage window, I saw flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and my heart nearly stopped. 2 police cars were parked in front of the house, and Amber stood in the driveway with 2 officers, her face streaked with tears, waving her arms as she pointed toward the garage. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm, to remember that I had done nothing wrong. Within moments, the officers were at the door, their knock firm but not aggressive, and I opened it slowly, my voice steady as I greeted them. They explained that Amber had claimed I was refusing to leave and becoming a danger, but when I showed them the court documents, the injunction, and even Richard's card, their expression shifted. One of them excused himself to speak quietly with Amber, and through the window, I saw her face contort with frustration as she waved her hands and argued. Finally, the officer returned, handed me my papers, and in a calm but firm voice told me to remain here and call if anything escalated. Then they left, their lights fading into the distance, leaving the driveway in silence once more. I sank onto the edge of my small couch, my hands trembling, because I had just stared down the moment I had feared for so long, and somehow I had come through it. But the real twist was yet to come, the one I never saw coming, the moment that would turn all of this on its head and bring the story to a close in a way no one in that house could have imagined. The morning after the police left, the house was quieter than it had been in months, as if all the shouting and scheming had drained the very air from its walls. I sat in the garage, sipping my coffee slowly, letting the warmth spread through my hands, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle like a heavy blanket across my shoulders. For the first time in a long while, I felt something new, a fragile thread of hope, though I knew the storm wasn't over yet. By mid-afternoon, Amber returned, her car rolling slowly into the driveway, but she didn't storm in this time. She came inside with a cool, icy calm that was more frightening than her anger, carrying a folder of papers under her arm. She told Tom in a voice that trembled with rage held just beneath the surface that she was leaving, that he had ruined everything, and that she was done waiting. She said she had already filed for divorce and that she was taking what was hers, leaving him to rot with me in the house. The words hit him like stones, and he sank into the couch, silent, staring at the floor, as she marched upstairs to gather her things. When she left an hour later, slamming the door behind her, I felt the first ending of our long nightmare settle in. Tom sat across from me in the living room for the first time in months, his face pale, his eyes hollow, and he whispered that he was sorry, truly sorry, and that he didn't know how he had let things go so far. He said he was ready to make things right, to sign whatever papers were needed, to give me back everything that was mine. I nodded slowly, feeling a complicated mix of sorrow, love, and the quiet relief of a mother who finally saw a glimmer of redemption in her son. Richard arrived 2 days later with a thick stack of papers, and I watched as Tom signed each one, his hand trembling, his face drawn tight with shame. The house was mine again, fully and legally, the nightmare of hidden deeds and forged signatures finally over. For a moment, I thought that was the end, that justice had come in the form of survival, that I could finally breathe again. But life, it seems, wasn't done with its twists. A week later, I was sitting at the kitchen table, sorting through old letters, when Richard called with a tone I had never heard before, half amused, half incredulous. He said that during the final review of the property and bank records, they discovered something remarkable. Amber hadn't just tried to sell the house behind our backs. She had secretly taken out a line of credit in her own name using forged documents, and in doing so, she had left a clear paper trail of fraud. Even worse for her, the man she had been talking to, the one she had promised to split it with, was under investigation for real estate scams, and he had already turned over text messages implicating her. I sat there, stunned, listening as Richard explained that the bank had frozen her accounts, the credit line was nullified, and the authorities were now investigating her actions. In a single sweep, the woman who had tried to take everything from me had lost it all: her money, her reputation, and her hold on my son. It was as if the universe had waited for the right moment to place justice gently but firmly in my lap. When Tom heard the news, he broke down in tears. He said he would cooperate fully, that he would testify if needed, and that he wanted nothing more to do with her. He spent the next weeks quietly helping me clean out the house, repairing small things he had once ignored, and each evening we would sit together at the kitchen table, sharing simple meals in the quiet of our reclaimed home. As spring rolled in, I stood in the garden one sunny morning, the scent of fresh earth and blooming lilacs around me, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. The betrayal, the fear, the nights in the cold garage, All of it had led to this moment where justice had been served without me ever having to lift a hand in anger. Amber had taken herself down with her own greed, and my son, humbled and remorseful, had finally come back to me in a way I had thought was lost forever. I whispered a thank you to my late husband, to the home we had built together, and to life itself for giving me the strength to endure, and for letting the truth rise in the end like the sun after a long, dark night. And as I closed the garden gate and walked back toward the house that was once again truly mine, I knew that whatever came next, I had won. Not through revenge, but through resilience, love, and the quiet certainty that the right people always get what they deserve in the end.